Many Black Americans think they're entitled to taxpayer money for wrongs that were committed by people from generations long ago. Well, this video is dedicated to dispelling lies and instilling truth to the so-called reparations argument. Please watch until the end of the video so you fully understand my view. Let's begin. Starting around the year 1619, Africans were forcibly shipped from their homeland in Africa to the New World, meaning North and South America. The history books would like students to believe that white people were solely responsible for this horrific practice. The reality is quite different. We see this map of a particular triangular trade route. There were others, but this represents one of them. It shows Europeans traveling to the western coast of Africa in order to trade manufactured goods for slaves. The slaves were then shipped to the New World in exchange for raw materials such as sugar and tobacco, which were then taken back to Europe. What is usually not mentioned is that African tribes willingly participated in the slave trade. A ship from Europe, let's say from the coast of England, would sail from England to the western coast of Africa to trade manufactured goods for African slaves. The African tribes, who were at war with each other, would trade captured Africans to the Europeans for manufactured goods, usually firearms and ammunition. These weapons and ammunition could then be used to win more wars against other African tribes, and the subsequent captured Africans could be traded for more weapons and ammunition, and the cycle would continue. In other words, the African tribes enabled the slave trade to exist. For the next 250 years or so, blacks in America would be subjected to the horrors of slavery. Beginning in 1861 and ending in 1865, the United States engaged in a war between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South, commonly known as the Civil War. During the 1800s, as the United States was expanding westward, Congress was trying to keep an even balance between the free states and the slave states. However, by 1860, most Southerners could see the writing on the wall and realize that as more free states were being admitted to the Union versus slave states, the North would eventually greatly outnumber the South and would be able to outvote the South when it came to any number of issues that came up for a vote in Congress. The South decided that secession was the only answer. Here we see a photo of 3 Confederate soldiers. Most people who attended public school think that the vast majority of Confederate soldiers came from wealthy families who owned plantations, such as this image of Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana. The truth is that most Confederate soldiers came from a much more humble background, as seen in this photo. The reality is much different than what many people believe. The vast majority of Confederate soldiers came from modest farms and did not own any slaves. In fact, only about 10% of the soldiers owned slaves. The truth is that most of the soldiers were fighting to maintain the South's way of life, which happened to include slavery for some of the people. Let's take a closer look at the photo on the right. Here we see a typical rural farm from the mid-1800s. We see a father, a mother, and 3 daughters. Whether the father wanted to fight in the Confederate Army or not, he would have most likely done so, either by his own will or as a result of being drafted. Chances are he would have been severely injured or killed in the war. As a result, the wife would no longer have had a provider and a protector. In addition, many Southern farms had livestock and crops confiscated by the Confederacy for the war effort. Any Southern family who got caught sympathizing with the North also risked having their entire farm burned. By the end of the war in 1865, many Southern farm families were without men, crops, or livestock, making it very difficult to survive. The surviving white farm families had to start over, just like the newly freed slaves had to. It was a difficult time for all in the South. Here's a drawing that depicts Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea. The march of his soldiers from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Savannah. During this march, Sherman's army wreaked havoc on the land. The army tore up railroad tracks, pulled down telegraph poles, and burned buildings. Along the way, thousands of blacks, who now considered themselves free, followed the army to the sea. When Sherman's army was finished, Sherman tried to figure out what was to become of the newly freed blacks. The blacks wanted a way to make a living for themselves outside of slavery. The federal government decided that these many thousands of Georgian slaves should each get 40 acres of land and a mule, and set aside land in Georgia for that very purpose. However, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865 near the end of the Civil War, his successor, Andrew Johnson, decided against the idea. To this day, one of the biggest arguments that Black Americans use in favor of reparations is that the government reneged on this promise. Okay, they have a point. But just because someone gives you something doesn't mean it will turn out well for you. A father could give his son $1 million on his 18th birthday, and the son could go and gamble it all away in a relatively short time, while another person might wisely grow that same amount into $1 billion. On December 6th, 1865, the United States ratified the 13th Amendment. Any time for reparations to the ex-slaves from the federal government would have been at this time, but the government did not do so, which is a shame because the ex-slaves did deserve it. Through the subsequent generations, the entitlement of reparations to these Black Americans becomes less and less deserved. To former slaves? Hell yes. To the children of former slaves? Maybe. To the great, 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 great grandchildren of former slaves? Absolutely not. There comes a point where a person needs to take accountability for his bad decision making in life. And the year 2026 is definitely at that point. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that the federal government did decide to pay reparations to all of the descendants of slaves. Just imagine how complicated that would get. Here's an image showing the different skin shades of Black people. As you can see, some Black people are very dark, while others are fairly light. Do the darkest individuals get the full amount? Do the lightest individuals get the least amount? And what about the people in between? Do they get a partial amount? And what about the descendants who also have slave owner ancestry? Do they get nothing because they have ancestors who were actually part of the problem? Well, as far as this topic goes, and the arguments that Black Americans are making in favor of reparations, my view is that this whole thing is bullshit. What do you think? Let me know in the comments.